I picked up this anecdote from my exegesis professor, and I think he picked it up from scientists who work in AI. And the point of the anecdote is that this phrase, time flies like an arrow, the meaning of the sentence can change depending on the various ways that we can interpret each word in the sentence. Time flies like an arrow. And it's kind of a funny story, but it also kind of proves the point. Depending on how you interpret each of these words, can really shift the meaning of the sentence. And so the first way that we can understand this is pretty simple. Time flies like an arrow flies. And so when we say time flies like an arrow, what we're saying is that time proceeds as quickly as an arrow proceeds. And so just like an arrow flies, time flies. Pretty straightforward so far. And so this is how we would diagram this sentence. Time flies like an arrow flies. And so like becomes a simile, and so it introduces the simile that time flies like an arrow flies. The other second way that we can understand this is time flies like an arrow. And what this means is that we would time flies like you would time an arrow. And now we're shifting time from a noun. The first way that we understood it as a noun. Now we're understanding it as a verb. And so what we want to do when we say time flies like an arrow, what we mean is that we're going to measure the speed of flies in the same way you would measure the speed of an arrow. So if we were to diagram it this way, now time moves to the verb spot. And so time flies like you time an arrow. So just the same way you would measure the speed of an arrow flying, we want you to measure the speed of a fly as it flies. The third way that we could understand this sentence, time flies like an arrow, now it means time flies like an arrow times them. And so now arrows are the one that are timing flies. So we're going to measure the speed of flies in the same way an arrow measures the speed of flies. And so arrow now becomes the subject of this simile, this clause introduced by like, instead of the direct object. And so how do we diagram this? We're going to time flies, so just the way we understood it in the previous time, like an arrow times flies. So arrows now are giving us the example of how we should time flies. And then finally, time flies like an arrow. What we mean is time flies that are like an arrow. And so now we're changing this word like. And so we want to measure the speed of flies that resemble arrows. And so it's still functioning as a simile here, but a little bit of a difference. Instead of like modifying time, it's like is modifying flies. So we want to time flies. Well, which flies do you want to time? We want to time those flies that look like an arrow or act like an arrow, something along those lines. And then finally, we can change like to a verb. And so time flies like an arrow. And what we mean is time flies. And also, we're taking time here as an adjective. So time flies. A particular kind of fly likes arrows. And so flies of a particular kind, i.e., time flies, are fond of arrows. And so the whole point of the story is, or flies, time now is an adjective, so it's modifying flies, so it would fit under the subject. Like now is a verb, and an arrow is the direct object. So time flies like an arrow. And so to sum this up, among computer scientists, this is summed up in an aphorism. Time flies like an arrow, but fruit flies like a banana. And so kind of a corny little way of understanding how this all works or how words work, but kind of proves the point. Depending on the meaning of each words in the sentence, it's going to determine how the meaning of the sentence